There are those who say what we're seeing really is the return of the West, that we're seeing that in North Africa and in the Muslim world that actually people do want to share our values.
Well, you have to be very careful here, and I think it's quite right to say that this might be more a story of globalization than westernization. In some ways, the Western media wants to see a shift in the direction of Western-style democracy, and that may possibly happen, but I would say it's quite a low probability outcome at this stage. One distinct possibility is that if democratic elections are held relatively soon in the aftermath of these revolutionary events, we might see gains by people who are very opposite of Western in their orientation. I'm thinking here of the Islamists, who've done well where democracy has been tried in the region, whether you look at Lebanon or Gaza. So one has to be extremely careful about assuming this
present so far. I mean, indeed, even in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood took a back seat to a certain extent.
I think that's true, and I think that's very calculated on their part. And the Western media, I think, may be a little naive in assuming that simply because they weren't standing up there in Tahrir Square that they're not going to play a major part in the run-up to elections in Egypt. And of course in Yemen, they've already seized the initiative quite openly. So I think right now it's way too early to say that secular Google-using, Facebook-using Democrats are going to be the winners here. Another obvious point which is worth making is that the military are in fact in charge in Egypt right now. And from the vantage point of historical revolutions, that's not what you would call a result. So I think it's much too early to regard this as a great moment of westernization, particularly with civil war raging in Libya.
But does it show at the same time that there is a great appetite for the sort of things you talk about in this book?
Well, there's an appetite for some of them. If you take a very long-run view, which my book Civilization does, go back 600 years, and in those days, North Africa and the Middle East was a centre of civilization. Indeed, by comparison, Western Europe was a bit of a backwater in 1400. But it was only really after around 1500 that the West surged ahead. And it surged ahead because of a combination of economic and political competition, science, private property rights and the rule of law, medicine which actually improved people's life expectancy, the consumer society, and the work ethic. And those 6 things that I call the killer apps of Western society or Western civilization are very attractive. It's just that many people around the world want to have some of them, but not all.
I mean, I looking at that list, I mean, obviously when we talk about science and medicine, that something a lot of people say that started in the Arab world to a certain extent.
And I show that if you go back to the 9th or 10th century, the Muslim world's far ahead of Western Europe. But it falls back in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries when the scientific revolution is an exclusively European phenomenon.
But the one thing that it seems to me to be, if you like, unique to the West is democracy. That's the one thing the other areas weren't ever really interested in.
Adam, I'm very careful not to call democracy one of the killer apps, because it's more like a sort of luxury software installation that you get to once you've downloaded the crucial institutions without which democracy won't work. Private property rights secured by the rule of law, some sense of constitutional government. Now, those really are much more important than having elections in which everybody gets to vote. What you see if you look around the world today is plenty of elections, but not much liberal democracy in many parts of the world. And I think that distinction between properly liberal democracy, in which freedom is secured for the individual, and democracy in which you just occasionally hold elections to say that the president's a great guy. I'm thinking here of a country like Russia or for example, Venezuela. There's a huge difference.
So it's not a case that the freer your society, the more successful you're going to be.
I think that is the case if you measure success over the long run. In the short run, though, relatively unfree societies like China are currently achieving the most rapid growth in the world. And it's therefore quite a confusing time. That's one reason I wrote the book, because we feel as if our Western model had a massive crisis, a financial and in many ways a crisis of confidence.
I mean, your conclusion is quite gloomy. I mean, you say we've got pusillanimous, and basically you say the Chinese are going to overtake us.
Well, they are going to overtake the United States in terms of gross domestic product, that's for sure.
Not necessarily per capita.
But not in per capita terms. That's a very, very long shot. But the critical question is, can we revitalise those institutions which have been crucial to our success, or are we going to allow them simply to ossify? And I'm much more more concerned in many ways about the West's loss of its mojo, loss of its self-confidence, than I am about the rise of China or the democratization of the Middle East.
So what do we need to revitalise? I mean, for example, we need to have a lot more aircraft carriers?
Well, it's partly military, although I wouldn't say it was primarily military. The key to understanding the success of a civilization is partly how good it is at science and economically driven innovation. And right now, we are losing our edge in educational terms. In many ways, the most telling chart in the whole book is the one that shows mathematical attainment at age 14. And I'm afraid Western countries are now far behind Eastern countries in that basic measure of aptitude.
Yeah, and yet, Google, Apple, Microsoft, primarily American, but with a very strong input from Western Europe and particularly this country. I mean, we're still leading in those cutting-edge areas.
I think it's a big mistake to assume that is going to continue to be the case, because the Chinese in particular are pouring resources into innovation, and they are producing very many more highly qualified, highly competent technicians, engineers and scientists, frankly, than the West is. And I think what we're going to see in the next 10 or 20 years is a bit of a wake-up, really, for those people who assume that as long as we've got Silicon Valley, we, the West, will be okay. I think that is no longer the case.
At the moment, it's still, about theft of intellectual property and all the rest. I mean,
that's not true.
There isn't a global Chinese creative company.
If you look at the way in which patents are being generated and approved in Asia, well, Japan already leads Western economies and has done for many years. South Korea is up there in the top 5. And you know what? China is about to overtake Germany in terms of new patents approved. And now that is a sign of just how rapidly they have moved from being simply an assembly line for Western technology to being innovators in their own right. So watch this space. I don't think we can complacently assume that we'll always have the innovative edge.
So what can we do? We can improve our education systems.
Well, that's obviously absolutely vital. The quality of secondary education in particular in the Western world has deteriorated drastically in the last 4 decades.
And yet Britain and America are still global leaders in international tables of university performance.
Well, those university league tables are very revealing, because they show, for example, that the whole of Western Europe has disappeared more or less completely from the top 100. And Britain has only a handful of universities that are still up there with the best resourced American universities. But what will be very interesting to see in the next 10 or 20 years is how rapidly Asian universities begin to compete in that top 100, top 50. And I think they are already competing there. After all you really need for a university to be a hub of innovation is a really substantial amount of money and free thought. The problem the Chinese have is they've got the resources, but they are nervous about the transition to full intellectual freedom. And I think our main hope as a society or a civilization is that we're still the freest thinking, we still have the freest press, we're still, in a sense, freest in terms of individual rights. And as long as that killer app is preserved, then I think we still are in for the chance. So my book's not pessimistic. I think we still have one
on that
edge.
basis, a rather cynical analysis would say, it's not in our interest to encourage democratization or human rights or things in China, because actually if they get those, they'll be able to leapfrog.
Well, that would be a very cynical view indeed. I rather incline to the view that these killer apps are good for everybody, and we should really want the whole of humanity to download them. Remember, of course, India, although it's not quite as big an economy as China's, and it's not growing quite as rapidly, does have many of the freedoms that we're talking about here, and isn't an authoritarian state, not least because, of course, it was under British rule for so long. And that could be one of the really surprising black swans, if you like, unpredictable events in the next 10 or 20 years, as India starts to be a real hub of innovation.
What about Britain, though? You're a Scot. Should we continue to try and be a global international player? Should we continue to talk about enforcing no-fly zones, exercising our power at the United Nations Security Council, or is that a delusion?
No, I don't think it's delusional. I think Britain is still a serious player in the international realm. Of course, the resources are not what they were, as everybody who thinks seriously about strategy is well aware. Well, it's extremely hard to cut it further than we have. I mean, Britain, in common with most West European countries now, is in a pretty parlous position in terms of its military capability. Ask anyone in Washington about this, and we are no longer regarded as the really serious military force that we were 20 years ago. But, you know, as I said, it's not just about war-making capability. It's about our ability to set a standard in terms of individual freedom and all the essential foundations of civilization that the rest of the world can look up to. In some respects, we still do that. But no, let's think Hollywood. Let's think of the cultural achievements that this country is still capable of. But in other respects, in the basics of education, I'm afraid we're slipping alarmingly far behind. And I hope that this coalition government is going to do something to turn that around. I'm optimistic about that.
We shall see. Well, the book is called Civilization, the West and the Rest, and there's a Channel 4 TV series about
starting on Sunday.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to you both.